Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about expanding Earth, because you hear we talk about it quite a bit, and a lot of folks say, please expand on expanding Earth. The irony. Now, for those of you who have an inkling of what it is, you may be sitting there with an open mind thinking, yeah, this makes actually physical sense based on the map of the world pushed on a heliocentric ball. Some of you will have no idea what this is, so you're going to have a really fun ride here. But it was just one of these things where someone shows you something you can't unsee, and that's what expanding Earth is. And it's one of these things because we have such a predisposition because of our upbringing, depending on how old you are, pangea drift, which is just based on hocus pocus, ridiculous geology. You have the flat Earth people who say, look, hey, there's this Peter projection map, and none of the continents are actually shaped the way that we have them on globes, on any of the pictures that we actually see from NASA. So something's wrong. Someone's lying. And then you have expanding Earth, which for me was revealed by Neil Adams, who is a famous cartoonist from the National Lampoon, of all the places to get information. I've heard interviews with him. I think he's a very genuine guy. And you have to understand the average IQ of an American citizen out of the 60s was probably double, if not more, of what anyone has today. Our schooling was not littered with globalist, think about your gender at 3 classes, right? Kids weren't vaccinated, having their minds destroyed by mercury and aluminum, such that they develop all these behavioral issues. I just heard of an interesting report yesterday that said that the amount of mental illnesses that psychiatrists have come up with so they can prescribe drugs so they can get that summer home is over 300 now. 300 little, microfractures in the way that a kid behaves and talks so they can say, you see that thing? You see I lifted his eyebrow and he moved his finger at the same time? He gets this drug, and I get the kickback. So expanding Earth goes deep. It goes deep into way more than just, oh, look, this is how the continents actually came together. Oh, look, this is how a celestial body actually forms and grows. It is linked to our fundamental understanding of how the Earth produces something called crude oil. And because of that tie, you're not allowed to know anything about it, which I know is the cliche of any conspiracy person. They don't want you to know. That's why that's the bait to make you want to know, right? But it's true. 1979, according to one insider into the Alaska oil pipeline, they said that they had absolutely categorically come up with the formula that converts methane gas into crude oil, which is then what we drill out of the ground. And expanding Earth will call to the ecosystem of the whole thing. Now, if you've heard every single episode, then you will have heard the gravity episode, which is extremely important for this. I'm going to rehash what I believe is important within the gravity episode because it all ties into this. This will also refine, I believe, your complete understanding of all the celestial bodies in our solar system and the role that the sun plays, such that you can see the full ecosystem of how this works. If you've ever struggled with the notion that how did Mercury get there and Venus and all these other planets? We have these gas giants way outside there. Most of what you're told in the pop culture of science is, I believe, to be completely incorrect. I did a huge deep dive on the chemistry of crude oil once I heard a person say, look, methane gas makes crude oil. And so I was like, oh, okay. Well, now I've got the clue. Let me just go take a look. And sure enough, there's this beautiful ecosystem of the whole thing. But let's start off with expanding Earth right away. Expanding Earth is the notion that the Earth does expand every single year and has been tracked to be doing so for decades. It is registered every year how much it grows as well. Now, from what I understand, there's a faction in Geneva that actually tracks this, and when they were not interrupted by the oil industry to say, what are you doing? This is going to reveal how oil is not a fossil fuel, and once people know it's not a fossil fuel, then we're not going to be able to artificially inflate its scarcity, and that's going to interrupt the petrodollar system, which is this weird, supply and demand rivet that every currency in the world happens to be connected to. They could connect it to something else, but they don't. If you take the Earth as it exists today, and you shrink all of the oceans and leave all of the continents and islands in place, every single landmass comes together perfectly, creating a perfect sphere that is about 1/4 the size of the sphere that we have today. The last time Geneva was actually allowed to record the expansion of the Earth, it expands approximately 19 centimeters a year. For those of you in standard, it's about 9 inches. 8 to 9 inches. The whole Earth's diameter expands 8 inches. Now, the Earth is gigantic, right? It's nearly 8,000 miles across diameter-wise, 24,000 miles around, roughly. To add that much circumference to a ball that's that big, you're talking about a tremendous introduction of some mass or force to get it to do that, or both, right? Now, any of you who've blown up a balloon, you know that you're not adding mass to the balloon. You're just simply putting air inside, and its outer crust will adhere to the inflation up to a point, and then it explodes, right? Well, there's going to be a huge correlation between expanding Earth and a balloon. Neil Adams, I will be probably playing his animation several times during this particular episode, so if you're on audio and you want to see this, make sure to get over to YouTube or get to deepthoughtsradio.com. I'm sad to say that vid.me, which I have embedded in many of my bumpers, is now going out of business. So if you try to follow that and it's dead, I'm sure they'll inform you at the front door it's gone. Very sad. Now, the other thing is that expanding Earth also explains virtually everything that we see on the surface of the Earth. But we are totally unaware that it's happening because no one describes it anymore. Even though Neil Adams was taught this in the late 50s, early 60s, it explains things. The Grand Canyon, which has been told to you that it was created by a glacier. Complete bullshit. It was ripped apart due to expanding Earth, except it didn't break through and create an ocean down below. It just created a nice ravine down there. Anytime you're looking at, mountainscapes in very rural areas of the world, and you see plates of the Earth slanted into the ground at some 30 to 45 degree angle, but it's not due to excavation for highways, although that's a good example of how it occurs. What you are seeing is two halves of Earth that have pulled apart. The sedimentary rock starts falling because the cliffs start to, subside into the cavern, and then eventually these plates will fall into the cavern that was created, and then it fills in to look like it's level. So at one point, the cavern between two rocks that are jetting down into the ground was really, really deep, like probably hundreds of feet deep, if not a mile deep. And as the sedimentary rock fell in, so did the plates, and when they finally collided down there, it started to fill up and level off to the Earth that we actually walk on today, which we would call sea level, right? Big giant plateaus that you see in southwest Arizona here in the United States. What you are seeing is the former surface rock that's way, way up there. The top of the plateau is the former surface rock that was there, and everything else has been eroded down through expansion. It keeps expanding, most of it falls down, and we all know that eventually, over a million years or so, all those plateaus are coming down as well. Devil's Tower, which we talk about a lot with No Forest on Flat Earth. The No Forest on Flat Earth guy was trying to say that's an old tree. It's not an old tree. What it is that at the top of Devil's Tower, you need to raise the soil level straight up to that minimum. It could actually be the center of a volcano that actually goes up a lot higher. But let's just say the surface soil went at least up to that point. What you were looking at with Devil's Tower is a crystallized, almost like tempered glass. Tempered glass is created by cooling one side of the glass faster than the other side of the glass, creating a crystallization base of which all the other structures of the glass can adhere to. Thus, when it breaks into tiny little comfortable pieces. Well, the Earth's magma does the exact same thing. Once a bunch of magma comes up, trying to escape through a volcano, if it doesn't, it will essentially cool off because it's being exposed to the atmosphere, it's being exposed to the soil, which is obviously a lot cooler, and you get the hexagonal pattern of crystalline formation based on its temperature. That's why you get these hexagonal patterns in rocks all over the world, but they're different diameters. The one at Devil's Tower is phenomenal, right? I mean, I think there's like 12-foot diameter hexagons, where if you go to Ireland or Scotland, you're starting to get one that is 6 inches. Okay? But what you have is it dried, and the soil around it, like a mold, just eroded away. So it's a phenomenal thing, and it's very, very rare. Now, the thing is when you compare it to Pangea drift, Pangea drift's major flaw is that they say that continents flow willy-nilly on the surface of the Earth. Yes, there are magma layers way down that will actually move from left to right and carry a lot of other things with them, but the continents don't move. They don't have, ball bearings down there that slip and slide. It's not the thing that the space shuttle gets pulled out on before it launches, right? No, these things are adhered to the surface of the Earth, and the only way that they have separated from each other is to be actually pulled apart by new soil, new land that's being created in the oceans. Now, for any of you who have Google Earth at your disposal, you can look at the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as two really, key characters when you're looking at, surface soil. There are, I should say this, every single clue that you need to see that will lead you to the proof of expanding Earth is right there in Google Earth. And, again, Google Earth didn't invent all this stuff. This stuff has been in maps since the 50s and 60s when we had a chance to do sonar and all kinds of planes and eventually, hopefully, satellites. But the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean have the remnants right down the center of exactly the point where the two continents on both sides of the respective oceans were connected. So, there's no doubt that the east coast of North America, or the North continents and South America, connected with Africa and Europe. We know they fit just like puzzle pieces. And we know if you go back the other direction, here comes Asia over as well. Now, what the Pangea drift folks do is they ignore the bottoms, and they basically push it all together in the top and make one giant island, and they say all the oceans were already there. They weren't already there. We know this through absolute factual proof because there's a guy that has been studying this for probably by now 30 years. When I first saw his presentation, it was like 24, 25 years. Here's what happens. The crust of the Earth varies in thickness, which means strength. The Atlantic Ocean was thicker and stronger. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is a seam, and the internals of the Earth that are boiling the outside crust start to spit up this new magma, this new rock sedimentary base product, and it comes up and it splits. One goes left and one goes right. And it started to push apart the respective continents. The Atlantic moved a lot slower because it was stronger and thicker. The Pacific was either not as thick and thus weaker, or whatever pressure is happening on that side of the Earth was actually a lot stronger. Now, because I think the inside of the Earth is fairly uniform, I would say the Pacific is simply the result of a thinner crust. It's like when you put frosting on a cake, you're not getting it all perfect no matter how much you think you are. You're just not. So the Pacific has a line all the way down the center, and from the line, this guy has been tracking it now for, again, probably about 30 years, the plates that come out of the seam. One goes left, one goes right. They're kind of longer than they all are taller. He has named the plates in his lifetime and seen them move, according to his presentation. But regardless of his observational research, it is very apparent when you look at it what you're seeing. All right? So that's how the ripping and the expansions occurred. All right, now, every other place, the Indian Ocean and other areas of the ocean that are kind of the auxiliary underbelly of Eurasia, are the same exact principle at just variable levels. And so you can see in the bottom of the ocean their structural integrity issues as well. But what we think ended up happening here, which is very, very telling, and it brings together a tremendous amount of geological history, is that the Pacific Ocean, because it was expanding so much quicker than the Atlantic Ocean, and because the two hadn't been connected yet, there was still quite a bit of land separating the two areas of the ocean. The Atlantic Ocean remained higher in its level of water than the Pacific, because the Pacific's expanding really, really fast, and so its sea level's going way, way, way down. The estimation is that the Atlantic Ocean at one point was nearly a mile higher than the Pacific. Now, technically speaking, that's just an observational estimate based on this guy's research, which I'll try to link all of his stuff down there too. I forgot his name. It's a 3.5-hour presentation, so it's quite an investment. But around Indonesia, especially if you look at the Google Earth map, you can see the sludge mark on the ground where he asserts the next point, which is going to explain some of my childhood as well. At one point, it broke. And this Atlantic sea level, which included the Indian Ocean as well, spilled down into the Pacific. The amount of height was so high that by the time the Atlantic had spilled down into the Pacific, it's starting to level the whole playing field out between all the oceans. Obviously, on the Atlantic side, you got a lot of land being revealed because the sea level is going to go way, way down. But it hit the bottom of the ocean so intensely, you see this huge sludge mark of the cataclysmic event of the two oceans coming together. That sent a tidal wave towards North America and South America, probably more towards sort of the Alaska all the way down to Baja, Mexico. But here it comes. A gigantic wave carrying a tremendous amount of soil, rock, and the tiny bit of life that had managed to gain life in the Pacific Ocean. Now, I grew up in the Midwest in the center of America, Kansas, all right? And when you dig around as a kid, you will find little tiny crustaceans in the rocks in Kansas. Nothing big. If you find a fish, it's because it grew recently and someone's tossed it to the side. But these fossils were all over the place when I was a kid. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, we used to have an ocean here, but it dried up. Now, geographically, it makes very little sense that would have occurred had this other event not helped the event. Now, if you've ever been to California or gone up and down the west coast of America, there are some bumpy hills between us and the center of the United States. We've got the Rocky Mountains, or the gigantic formations that are there. I am willing to wager that this wave was so huge and so big that it actually contributed to the rock formations that we actually see on the west coast, that it actually jammed some of the plating up. But at nothing else, this gigantic wave of Pacific Ocean, which you have to understand might be miles high by the time it hits the coast. We don't really know. But it took a bunch of soot and sedimentary rock plus fish and fossils and pushed it into the Midwest. The whole thing became sort of a bed of water. And then it just dried up, just like a salt flat. And there we have all of our crustaceans and little tiny, fossilized beings out there. Now, regardless of the last part of that theory, you can look at the map by Indonesia and you can see it. And you have to be willing to acknowledge that happened. Because regardless of what shape you think this place is, it looked like it was a very organic event. It doesn't look like it was something that aliens did, right? And I find that personally kind of warming. Now, when Neil Adams came out with his video, which I believe is around 2005, I don't know why he didn't pursue it as much as he could have, but he pursued it to an extent that was actually quite amazing. And he analyzed every celestial body that we ever have claimed to have brought pictures back from. For some of us who now doubt that dinosaurs are actually real, based on all the fraudulent paleontology that's been going on for decades and centuries, he actually embedded the dinosaurs in his theory, which was kind of interesting. But he does talk about the duck-billed platypus very specifically. And he says that, well, there's a weird factoid about this animal in the world, which is that it exists on all continents. We already knew that all the vegetation at the joining sides of each one of the continents actually either has continued to exist, meaning if there's an elm tree on one side of Asia, when you map it over to the North American area or the Americas, you'll find it over here as well. Or at least there's some fossilized evidence that the two had similar, vegetation. But the nice thing is with this theory is that the hemispheres of which these various regions that are connected exist is the same climate as the hemisphere that it connected to. So again, South America and South Africa and even Australia, they all work together and they have the same season, and then the North Americas all have their same season. But the duck-billed platypus managed to make it on all the continents, something I was totally unaware of. I don't think I've ever seen one. So the interesting part about this story is that when Neil Adams was asked, why does the world expand? And when this guy was doing his presentation about expanding Earth, his 3-hour presentation at some university, neither one of them wanted to go for it. They did not want to get into how this works. And probably because, it opens them up to so much speculation that the community at large could shoot them down. Now, what you can't shoot down, and I showed it to my buddy Robert Llewellyn once in my office, and I said, what do you think about this, dude? And he sees it, and he literally goes, well, that's pretty hard to deny once you see it come together. Meaning, I've seen this makes complete sense, but I'm not ready to believe this just yet, right? And my research hadn't gone the full distance, I don't think, by the time I showed it to him. So here's what I believe is occurring. And it dovetails beautifully with, again, I've covered this a lot in other episodes, so I apologize for the repeat, but the electric universe model, which is that I like to take that and call it the ethereal model of the universe, right? I heard someone talk about it the other day, trying to use, Einstein's work and basic physics and quantum physics, talking about the way that we actually attempt to move the speed of light and all this other stuff. And he kept using dumb words to describe ether. Everything he was saying was ether. If he just crossed back over to Tesla, to Faraday, everything would have been explained and he'd have a word for what he was talking about. But the world and the universe and everything that we experience as a mass entity, I'm not saying your soul, is based on an ethereal cloud of these particles that move. They move up to 50 times the speed of light. That's what Faraday and Tesla and Eric Dollard were able to confirm. Eric Dollard is a guy who's still alive in our age, who actually resurrected their research. The ethereal particle itself doesn't have any physical charge of any kind. The charge is all based on our designation of how it moves in space and time. Now, I'll give you an example of, proof of ethereal winds, in my opinion. Anytime you see the Fibonacci pattern, you are looking at the descending orbit of an ethereal pattern, which creates life on a macro scale as well as life on a micro scale. On the micro scale, an orbit of ethereal wind is classified as an electron, neutron, or proton. One step up, you call it an atom. Another step up, you call it a cell. When you look at the various patterns of a rose bloom, for instance, all of the petals are coming out in the same macro pattern as the micro pattern of its actual atoms that go down below. I have vines all over my backyard, and every once in a while, when they're starting to crawl out from wherever they've been hiding in the wintertime, you'll see a vine come out, and it does this absolute spiral drain down, just a little green little doodad, and it ends right there. And it's essentially a time-lapse frame of what happens when you drain the drain in your bathtub. And again, when you flush a toilet, there's actually a pump that actually, there's a hole that jets the water down. And so that's being arbitrarily pushed in that direction. That's why, down south, they push it in a different direction. Everyone thinks it's this effect, of being on the south part of the world, which may indeed be the case. But anytime you just take a still body of water and you pull the plug, there's a vector where it goes in a circle. So you see it all the time. Anytime there's a sinkhole in a pond or a lake, it doesn't just go straight in. It actually starts to spiral, and everything around it starts to spiral. And no one's in there, stirring it up. It just happens. It's an organic thing. So when you start zooming up the model and getting it up to a planetary level and up to a solar system and universe and that sort of thing, that's where you get these spiral galaxies, right? As it is above, so too it is below. It's the same algorithm of movement. And essentially has to do with a particle trying to move in a straight line. But it's being hit and hit and hit by all of its neighbors from all different directions. And it eventually starts to create this spiral because of all the influence on it, right? Plus, they start to behave together like a crowd. You ever try to get out of a concert that's packed or try to move in Mardi Gras and New Orleans, you have to move where the group moves, which is usually there's some path of least resistance up there that allows the crowd to move, and that's why you move in that direction. You've all seen red blood cells pulsing through veins and arteries, right? Same thing. In the universe, though, it's all three-dimensional. So this is why we get spheres. This is why we get things that spin that we call atoms, right? Now, consequently, the reason why a photon is so elusive to scientists is that they try to push a photon into the same spiral categorization as all the other things that we call atoms and what have you, which again are all the same thing. It's just it spins differently, and we give it this classification of a positive or a negative. Okay? Sorry, this is getting a little complicated, but the difference, just to button this up real quick, is that a photon is a verb and not a noun. And so is everything else, right? A spin is a verb. You look at the behavior of a particular spin, you'll call it an electron or neutron, okay? But a photon is really a very temporary reaction to colliding forces. When you look at an LED and how it produces light, you have electrons that are stimulating an hour valence of metal, and it creates and pops off a photon, because the photon is more like what you would call the moment of impact or something, right? So the reason why you need to understand the fundamentals, that everything is built out of these ethereal particles, is you have to understand, once you get that, your understanding of mass and energy in the universe automatically becomes very, very simple, because it's all the same stuff. And, E equals mc squared, whatever. I think most people understood that was the case. You take a log and you burn it, and it turns into thermal energy, and then the ashes can come back down and turn back into a log. I mean, there was this cycle that we were seeing forever, right? But the sun is obviously one of the largest objects we have access to. Again, I'm going to go with heliocentric for now, this 93 million mile away ball. But it has the constant bombardment to us of its mass energy model, which is, again, all the same stuff, right? Now, if I said to you that the Earth is being injected by the sun, your thought process as a layman, let's just say, you didn't get into this stuff when you were a kid, goes, no way, we have a hard crust. There's no way that things could just go inside the Earth. Well, that's if you haven't thought of this ethereal model of the universe that the godfathers of electricity had figured out. If you take a little bit of physics, you start to realize that there's a lot of space between atoms. And then if you start getting to subatomic physics, you start to realize there's a lot of space between the stuff that's in an atom. One of the analogies I like to repeat from my physics class as a kid was that if you had an electron and a proton and a neutron at the center of the pitcher's mound, which is the interior nucleus of any basic atom, and they were sizes of oranges sitting on the home plate, or on the pitcher's mound, excuse me. Then the electron would be way at the edge of the stadium on the outside. It'd probably be about the size of a BB, is the way I had explained to me. It doesn't really matter what size these two objects are, but think about the difference in space between being just on the edge of the building and all the way inside the stadium to the pitcher's mound. It's a lot of space for things that are so teeny and tiny. Well, what if I told you that those things are actually nothing more than currents of ethereal particles, just like the current you would find when you pull the drain on your sink, pull the drain on your tub, or look at a current in the ocean or in a river. Those currents are being called atoms. Those currents are being called electrons, neutrons, protons. But instead of being a spiral conical thing down, it's actually a ball. It is a spinning ball of energy. And it doesn't really exist as a stationary object either. It is being renewed constantly. New ethereal particles are going into it, and at the interior, it's escaping. All it does is it escapes, and it goes off and rejoins another formation. It could go back into itself, like the sun. So it is very, very easy for the sun to share its ethereal mass with everything else that exists, and things are sharing their mass, with the sun. We know that space is not a vacuum, as much as they like to tell you it's a vacuum. That was a layman's explanation of space before we had ever been to space. Do you realize that? They had never claimed to have put an object in space before they told you the space is a vacuum. And it's the number one pop science lie that NASA has to deal with when trying to travel through space, because just the solar radiation minus any coronal mass ejection is so lethal that we don't have a single spaceship that man can get into right now that could protect man's health from the radiation of the sun. And if there's a coronal mass ejection, you're going to be a little piece of popcorn. You're going to pop. Now, if you're still following me, think about this. Any of you have played darts before? You know, the dart boards are all the same size around the world because there's a regulation for how big they make them, where the 20 spot is, where the bullseye is, where the super bullseye is, all that stuff, right? But now imagine someone were to take that and make it 10 feet in diameter. You got the same size darts. Now that bullseye is about the size of a normal dartboard. It's a hell of a lot easier to hit, especially if you can stand the same distance away from it, right? Now let's imagine someone made it 6 inches in diameter. Now the bullseye is almost impossible to hit because it's so teeny tiny, right? So if you had a small target and everyone's playing darts trying to hit that target, you're going to have more darts in the wall around that little tiny dartboard as you would the one that's 10 feet. In 10 feet, the only guy who's not going to hit that thing is the guy who's had too much to drink, right? It's probably in his foot. Well, that's what happens with all celestial bodies when you're around an emitting object that we call a sun. The sun's going to shoot it in all directions constantly. That's why you can see it. That verbal reaction, which I call a photon, is sort of the ripple in the pond. When I say, hey, why don't you go get me the ripple out of the pond? I'm going to throw the rock in there, and then when you see the ripple, I want you to grab it and bring it to me. And you're going to look at me going, what are you, a moron? I say, well, what's the problem? And you go, well, the ripple doesn't really exist, dude. It's more of like a wave of energy, and you can see it, but it doesn't really exist. I can't just get it for you. It's all the particles that make up water that are creating this ripple effect. Well, that's what a photon is, people. That's why you can't put it in a bottle. It is a verbal reaction to something that happens to actual objects, which we call ethereal particles. But you will know that a ripple creates a tsunami. So it's a very dangerous and active object in the universe, depending on how it happens, when it happens, and who it happens to. So the sun is constantly creating these three-dimensional ripples of photons in all space on a minute, tiny scale, the smallest scale that exists. The Earth, before it started to expand and create oceans, okay, that was expanding the entire time. We'll rewind time all the way back to the beginning, but just about the time that the Earth's crust could not stay together anymore because it didn't have enough mass, it didn't have enough dirt, literally, to continue creating new areas to fill it up. It started to break and tear. And this is where we get the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Black Sea, the Grand Canyon, a lot of these bodies that when you use Neil Adams' algorithm and you just bring them back together, you'll start to see that the left side of the Black Sea, or I should say the north side and the south side, actually match up. It happens all over the world. And he just did one after another after another. And he's done it to the moon, he's done it to Mars, and he's done it to, I believe, Europa. And it's astonishing how accurate this is. And it coincidentally, either, I hate to even say this, but it's the best evidence that NASA's ever been out there. Now, it could be that by the time Mars came around with all of our sophisticated technology, they understood that expanding Earth is the way that planets form, and so they algorithmically created it like that. It's a bit of a stretch. But Europa, I believe it's Europa, and definitely the moon, passed the test. Let's go back and finish up the how this works thing. At the center of every celestial body is pure energy, plasma energy. If you want to know what plasma energy is, I would simply say it is the stem cell of all atomic mass. It is the most generic form of, I would say, almost liquefied electricity created by ether particles. It's where they've held their form, but they don't hold it in any way, shape, or form that we would call an atom. But as soon as it escapes the captivity of its neighbors, all right, it immediately becomes something. So it's a very versatile product for the universe to use to build things. Now, if you look up the sun in Wikipedia, for instance, they will tell you that there's a plasma core inside the center of the sun. What they don't tell you is it's probably black, and that's why you get sunspots, where there's a tear in the thermal reaction that's going on the surface of the sun, and you actually are looking into the bowels of the sun. That's what a black spot is on the sun, in my opinion. All those who have now moved over to the electrical universe cosmology model have essentially verified that all of the swimming, burning particles on the surface of the sun match all of our on-Earth laboratory experiments of burning fuels using electricity. So the behavioral patterns are exactly the same. And that goes for whatever you think the sun is. The surface of the sun is hotter than the interior of the sun. Well, that's because the interior of the sun is still pretty generic. It hasn't decided to become thermalized, hasn't decided to become rock or anything. It's still in its infant stage of creation, held together by gravity, which is not a pull, but a push. Our planet has a plasma core as well. The moon has a plasma core. Every gas giant has a plasma core. Everything has a plasma core in the universe. Probably starts off a minute little thumbnail of plasma energy, and it simply continues to grow by its own behavior. It probably starts to thermalize on the outside a little bit. If there is passing iron or hydrogen or carbon, it can get sucked into the gravity of that object, because in the Deep Thoughts world, if you go view the gravity episode, gravity is the traditional force that is created through negative space, created by an object blocking the normal force that would be coming at your chest. The analogy I always give on the show is if you've ever been in the middle of a park where it's really windy and you got a friend and you're walking towards each other, you're getting beat up uniformly, maybe at 10 feet by the wind, but as soon as you get within 6 inches of each other, their back is blocking your chest, your back is blocking their chest, and there's this negative space between you. You're drawn together because you're being pushed together by what's on the outside of you, not pulled together through some mysterious, ridiculous phenomenon definition that is still the going definition of gravity. So when the Earth was smaller, it grew slower because it's a smaller little target, the smaller dartboard. As it got larger, it starts to become easier to hit. And we're now expanding, and we always will be now expanding faster than we ever have in the past because we're a bigger target. The moon is said to be way larger, and it is, than it should be for an object like the Earth. It's 1,200 miles in diameter, where we're 8,000 miles in diameter. That's a gigantic object to be circling us. A celestial body's gravity is actually going to have to be the combination of its diameter and its ability to block other ethereal winds, but also has to deal with the resilience of its internal core, preventing things from going straight through the object. And so let's just say this, if the moon was more permeable than the Earth, then it could have less gravity than the Earth would have if it was the same size as the moon, because it's perhaps denser and keeps out ethereal particles from ever traveling through the left side, going through the middle, going out the right side. But if our moon is not so resilient, if the plasma core inside is not as dense, which we do not know at this point, then it could actually weigh a lot less at 1,200 miles. We are taught that all gas giants in the solar system are baby planets, that they haven't really condensed down to make a planet. I'm going to suggest the complete inverse. Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, they are all old planets that have simply expanded so much that the crust is ruptured and it's atomized. It's turned into dust, plus it's collecting everything like a vacuum cleaner in the universe, right? That God Jupiter exists to do that service for us, right? It keeps us well protected. But I told you that this is linked to crude oil manufacturing. Now let's get into that. There's a great exercise you can do, which is to look up the components of the sun, especially the surface of the sun. What's it made out of? Well, it's made out of approximately, I would say, 50 to 60% hydrogen. There's a good 40% plus of helium. And then there's this tiny little single-digit percent, which is divided up among a lot of different things. And one of them is actually oxygen, believe it or not. There's a teeny amount of oxygen out there. Now, a lot of you might ask, and have asked in your lifetime, how does the sun keep going? How does it keep burning? How does it have fuel to do that? Wouldn't it just pop? I mean, if I pour gasoline out here, no matter how much I pour, I light it on fire, it burns for a few minutes, and it goes away. How's this thing continuing to go forever? Well, there's a word called fusion. And fusion means that there's enough force out there, enough mass / ethereal particles, that as soon as something goes from a generic state to an actual atom, maybe a hydrogen atom or a helium atom, both of which will blow up beautifully, then it thermalizes, it blows up. It gives off its verbal reaction, which is photons. We get the friction of the photon, which creates heat. But at the atomic level, at the sun's surface, 97, 98% of all that goes back into the sun and gets crushed back into its fundamental particles. And then it gets crushed back into orbital patterns that will create, again, the exact same stuff that blew up in the first place. So it's constantly renewing its own supply. It's as if the exhaust from your gas tank is being crushed back into gasoline and goes back in the tank. And so it just keeps going and going and going. It's brilliant, right? I'm sure if Earth got anywhere near the size of the sun, it would also turn into a star. But, you have to come up with the mass, the ethereal particle count in order to do that. You have to come up with the spiral configuration such that it'll start thermalizing at that level. That's going to be a long time away if it ever happens at all, which it probably won't. But now let's look at the two most fundamental, atoms in the universe. One is hydrogen and the other one's carbon. The most common thing in the universe, period, right? Now we all know that in order to create an atom of a higher level of complexity, like a gold atom or uranium atom, boy, I say that 10 times, you have to crush a bunch of atoms together to get them to bind with each other, meaning their orbital patterns, their ethereal orbital patterns get interlocked with each other in such a way that in order to break them apart, you need a tremendous amount of force. They're essentially weaved together in the way that they spin, and they're the relationships. That's where we get our various designations of force. A methane particle is made of one carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. Hydrogen is the stuff that's actually going to explode when you burn methane gas. If any of you have seen the explosions in Mexico City where they have a bad sewer system and the whole place exploded, you see this in China every once in a while where methane gas blows up and the manhole covers fly up and kill people, right? It's happened all over the world. Well, we find methane gas all throughout the crust of the earth, but it's mostly towards the top because it's this simplistic atom. But then when we dig deep, we find this stuff called crude oil. And, I need to remind you guys, if you don't know, that in the early 1800s, crude oil was all over the surface of the earth. Texas literally had like tar pits of this stuff all on the surface of Texas. They were just scooping it off the ground. Now, what's going to happen when you build a planet out of carbon atoms, okay, and you have this stuff called hydrogen that's hanging out, and its first incarnation is a methane particle. And it's down inside the crust, and it constantly gets crushed by carbon atoms. When any of you have baked food, when you mix two substances together, you've played with Play-Doh, and if you had a bunch of red and a little bit of blue, and you just mushed them all together, you're going to have more red than blue. Well, that's exactly what happens in the creation of crude oil. The Earth's crust crushes hydrogen atoms with carbon atoms, and it creates this sludgy stuff called crude oil. Now, for those who are hanging on to fossil fuel and peak oil theories, let's make this clear really fast here. All fossil records cease about 16,000 feet down into the ground. That's about 5,280 feet in a mile. So I'm only talking about 3 miles down, there's no more life. There's no ferns, there's no dinosaur bones, which is all bullshit anyway. There's no crustaceans like the ones I find in Kansas. It's done. But the Russians have dug nearly 9 miles into the ground and found ample supplies of crude oil. Saudi Arabia has drilled one of the reserves completely empty and capped it, and it filled back up. 100%, right to the very top. Now, are we manufacturing new fossils down there? New dinosaurs, new old ferns? You might think, there's just this little pocket down there, and then that freed the other pocket to spill into this pocket. It doesn't work like that. Right? It doesn't work like that. The Earth will be making crude oil forever. As long as it exists and has a crust and doesn't turn into a Jupiter, it'll be making crude oil constantly. The Midwest, my parents and grandparents own oil wells to this day, and that you can drill them dry and they fill back up. Okay, it's because it's an organic thing that the world makes. But how did they get this stuff classified as a fossil fuel? Well, funny thing is they took a crude oil atom and broke it apart and said, well, there actually is a tiny portion of oxygen in a crude oil atom. Well, there's a tiny bit of oxygen, almost to the same exact ratio, on the sun's surface. So is that organic too? Was that made from a dinosaur? No. It's just when you slam a bunch of atomic energy together / ethereal particles, you are going to get offspring that have nothing to do with the core byproduct, which in this particular case would be hydrogen and carbon mixing together. Stuff is in the way. It could be a bubble of air gets pushed down inside. It's just a random event that occurs, right? But in 1892, as I have it communicated to me, the Rockefeller family was able to win the designation, the scientific designation, that crude oil was a fossil fuel and thus scarce. And again, as the journalism that I have read about the subject from 1830, when they really started marketing oil in a few different areas up to the 1890s, they never were able to increase the price of oil because it was just everywhere. How could you tell someone that stuff floating in your backyard, that's so rare? Right? The guy's like, really? I pick it up and I take it somewhere and it's back there the next day because it keeps replenishing. So you can see with this particular chain of science, the oil companies cannot have you figure out expanding Earth because it will just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper until all of a sudden there's a little ding in your head where you now understand the full ecosystem of the universe at large. It also threatens, ethereal particles threaten a lot of the BS that's coming out of the, your physics community, your quantum physics community, your CERN Hadron Collider community that's still looking for the Big Bang, which could never occur based on ethereal particle models. You can't have a singularity, if gravity is a push and not a pull. But their absurd theory of it being a pull has never been remotely explained. Never remotely explained. It's still listed as a phenomenon online, right? What's beautiful about expanding Earth, once you get into it and you start to understand it and believe it, is that as you travel around the world becomes amazingly explained. Like I said, if you ever see slanted rocks down into the ground, there's the famous formation up in Apple Valley where they filmed the Star Trek scene where Captain Kirk is fighting the lizard guy. And they've used this a million times. I think Orville's already used it. Everyone goes there and films. It's this beautiful, alien rock formation. Well, it's a bunch of slanted rocks down into the ground. All right? How do you think it did that? Well, wherever that was, there was a rip in the soil, creating a big crevasse and usually a V shape of some sort. When you go all the way down to the bottom, it reconnects. Sedimentary rock fell down into the crevasse, fills back up to sea level, but all the plates that are trying to hang on actually fall down into the crevice a little bit, and then it levels off, and there you go. You've got these formations. They're all over the place. Now, obviously, there's a lot of places where that hasn't occurred because you have canyons, you have Grand Canyons, you have the painted canyons, the painted desert, all that kind of stuff, right? And let's bring in two things. One is going to be a kind of a fanciful conspiracy theory, and the other one's going to be what I believe to be fair science. NASA at one point slammed a 500-pound piece of copper, I believe is the way they said it. They had to make it pure to keep the experiment pure, into the south pole of the moon. And what they were trying to do is kick up the dust that's on the South Pole such that they could hit it with light from the sun, or they could look at the light coming through it from the sun and take a spectrogram of what they think the chemical composition of the South Pole of the moon was made out of. The one interesting thing they said happened, I believe this has also happened if they have meteor impacts on the moon, but they said, which I don't know if they've actually technically really videotaped anything like that, but they said it rang like a bell. The moon rang like a bell. Well, what's a bell? A bell is an outer shell that has a harmonic to it. You hit it, but if it was full of something, then it would just tick. It wouldn't dong, right? So the inner core being a plasma ball automatically comes to my mind as to why it's ringing like a bell. When you study, the other one I was going to mention was hollow Earth. There's a lot of theories about hollow Earth, and at the North Pole and South Pole, there's these entry points, and you can go down there and crawl around, I guess, inside the center of the Earth, and there's a whole other civilization down there. Now, that's more fantasy than reality as far as I know. But if you study the Navy's implementation of things like HARP and a lot of the kind of covert naval communications mechanisms, I've heard it claimed several times from very regimented sources that they're able to communicate through the Earth to the other side of the Earth. Meaning, if you had a globe and you put a ship on one side of the globe and you immediately find the opposite side of the globe, that they say they can communicate straight through the Earth and talk to the other ship. Well, if it's a plasma core, there might be a technique of doing that. I would imagine there'd be a lot of interference, but I've heard it claimed that that's possible. Well, if it is possible, it must be related to the fact that the Earth might have a fairly empty core. Simply, and it doesn't have to be, by the way, a ball of plasma energy that's dense all the way through. It could be simply a shell that's very powerful on an orbital level that's able to keep, the crust where it is, right? And the other one is that what are we told about the interior of the Earth? We're told it's a nickel iron core, right? The idea that no one has ever remotely been to the center of the earth, but these scientists throw down like there's no question that that's the case, should make you laugh. It should literally say, holy crap, these people that we call scientists are really just bullshitting. They're coming up with good guesses, and they come up with animations or pictures or whatever, those cross-sections of the earth, and boy, it just looks scientific, right? I had a relative ask me the other day, because we were having a big conversation about NASA being completely fake, and I'm throwing her various theories and ideas. And I think I even threw an article I wrote on this whole thing, and she goes, would you consider yourself a citizen scientist? And the reason why she's asking me like that is because she works for NASA, and for her, a scientist is strictly defined as someone who's gone to an institution, gotten a piece of paper, and walked down the aisle and moved their tassel. That's what a scientist is today. Now, we know, if you're on this show, that means you've got a certification in dogma and propaganda in a lot of cases. Now, again, if you're studying mathematics and chemistry, things work or they don't work, and you will then have a degree that's really worth something because, hey, it's just the way it is. Engineering science is engineering science. You build a building wrong, it's going to fall down. You build it right, it stays up. So those are beautiful degrees that don't have any questions about their validity. When you come into theoretical physics and theoretical science and theoretical geology, you got to take a step back. But now, why did they say there was a nickel core? Why did they pick that? Why couldn't they say it was a ham sandwich in the middle, right? Because we look at compasses now. The minute that someone was able to put a little shaving of a conductive metal on a little spindle and they watched it go north and south, and as they moved around the room, it continued to be oriented north and south. They could spin it, the enclosure, and it kept north and south. They're like, holy crap. But what could do that? Well, if it was a charged nickel core, especially like a liquid nickel core, you could probably get that effect. But that's an absurd over-engineering of the theory. If you have a plasma core, then as the plasma core starts to emit from the surface via the North Pole and the South Pole because of a spinning sphere, you get the Van Allen belts for one. But you get a perfect set of ethereal particles traveling in this beautiful north-south polarity. And anything that's going to be balanced on a spindle, that we would call a compass, will feel that wave of energy and adhere to it. It's exactly like the shavings on a piece of paper when you put a magnet underneath it, and you can see the poles around a magnet. What you're actually seeing are ethereal particles following various designations of dielectric and electromagnetic energy. Right? Again, see the episode on gravity for a huge deep dive into that. Now, for my money, anyone who's entertaining alternate theories of the shape of the Earth, you have a lot of explaining to do. You have to not only account for the shape of the Earth, but you have to account for the ecosystem of its relationship to its partners in space, its planetary partners, its sun partner. Now, again, if we're in a matrix of some sort, I hate to step off too deep into this, but if we are in some sort of simulated reality or some consensus reality, as my other episode said, this could be a bunch of rules that we simply are kind of hive-minding together, and so it sort of occurs. But what's interesting about expanding Earth is that it seems as if, man was not present when all this occurred. Right? Our history goes back a very limited amount of time, and we don't find dinosaur bones or anything like that necessarily. We find little, blue algae churning into, single cell, multi-cell, all the way up. And that's what we see in the fossilized records everywhere on Earth. Right? And again, for those of you who are struggling with the dinosaur thing and this, this extinction event that supposedly happened off the north coast of South America, your biggest problem with that is that, I've said this several times on the show, man has, from the very beginning, dug into the ground. Before the mid-1860s, when we started finding the very first tooth of a dinosaur, which then had a body constructed around it, which just so happened to look exactly like the ones we found later on, and the femur bone that we found that had a body faked around it, and just so happened to find dinosaurs that are like that. And the skulls that we never found until recently that obviously look exactly like the ones that have been faked for years, right? We had moved, continents of soil. The Egyptians moved amazing amounts of limestone. The pre-Incas, whoever built Machu Picchu and all those other amazing things down there before the Incas took over, had moved a ton of soil. It's been moved in Africa and Turkey and Asia and all over the place, Europe even. And no one had found a single big bone ever. That's really all you need. They did not miss every single prehistoric animal. Now again, mammoths are different. Mammoths are just a slight evolutionary precursor to elephants. Saber-toothed tiger, perhaps a lynx or something that's going to be related to the cats of Egypt or something. Those are tiny little precursors, little species that died off for whatever reason. We overhunted them or whatever, right? But I think Neil Adams' assertion about the duck-billed platypus is one that's hard to overlook. According to his research, it's the only animal that exists on all continents. Now, before the dinosaur thing had come around and probably been extinguished by, again, Eric Dubay's research and then very easily confirmed research that you can do after you listen to his thing, is that the migration of birds is very interesting. And one of the things that Neil had put down was that whatever birds were before they were birds, perhaps the reason why things fly, and they try to fly from, again, one continent to another, flying over oceans to get there and that sort of thing, is obviously there's a seasonal survivability. You want to fly away from cold, and you want to fly to warm. Amen. Think about human beings. If we had wings, geez, I'd be in Hawaii all winter, baby. But he had an interesting theory that this creature that turned into a bird perhaps did this migration. The Shoshone Indians used to do this too, right? Used to go north in the summer and south in the winter, and they would grab food as they went along. They knew where everything was. It was a beautiful ecosystem. Well, birds do the exact same thing. That perhaps when these continents ripped apart from each other through this expanding earth evidence that we see in the bottom of the ocean, that, over time, it didn't happen overnight, right? So you would have this creature that could hop over the crack. And perhaps those who had an appendage that was sort of shaped like a wing, or maybe through just trying to cut the air with whatever they had, they ended up shaping their bones and their muscles from doing this. And eventually, for whatever reason, those that had feathers started to take flight. Then again, we could have creators that simply say, this is what's going to have to happen if this particular species is going to survive, and they zap it and they give it everything it needs. I think it's interesting that we do have some birds that don't really fly, right? A peacock can kind of glide from a high up place. Chickens don't really fly, right? They can kind of flip and flap around. So we do seem to have these sort of in-between species that have feathers but don't actually fly. But I think per capita, most things that have feathers do fly fairly well, right? Now, just to button up with some free thought here at the end, I do think it's interesting that if human beings truly evolved from some sort of ape precursor, some hominid precursor, I think that we would be living in Dungeons and Dragons pretty convincingly. We'd have elves, and we'd have dwarfs, and we'd have all these things. And I know that some of you may even believe that those things did exist, and perhaps they did. We haven't found any skeletal remains of that. We have dwarfism, which is a definite condition, but having a fully proportionate, perhaps not totally tiny human being that is, maybe an average height of 4 feet, but they're very proportional. And this has happened. We found pygmies and stuff in South America, and there's even some illustrations of the humans that don't have heads. Their necks and their face was all kind of blended together. There's illustrations of that from some of the people that came over. I don't know if that was someone, doing that, but I mean, drawing that just for sake of like a story. But we haven't found any, again, skeletal remains of those individuals. So it seems to be pretty hard to believe that after all the excavation, we haven't found something, especially if there's a suspicion. Now, we do have the elongated skulls, but again, if you you want to get on the bandwagon of alien skulls in South America, where the skulls are, literally cone-headed shape. You need to go and look at the various tribes of Africa. One of the names escapes me, but one of my buddies who's an African American, he said to me, he goes, that's nothing. He goes, here's the tribe I'm from, and he makes me look it up on my phone. He goes, see, they ban their skulls from childhood all the way up to adulthood, and the brain keeps growing into this crazy shape. Now, I don't actually know what the brain looks like inside of a cone-headed skull. Does the brain go up inside the skull, or is it empty? Usually it creates horrible headaches and stuff if you get too much fluid in your brain. Plus it starts to create just a lot of bad development, like a hydrocephalic situation. So when everyone comes to me and criticizes my open-mindedness to allow people to talk about things like flat Earth, and I say, look, I'm heliocentric, but it's not because of just reading, Barnes & Noble books about what the world looks like. I do believe the Peter projection map is something that no one's answered for, and there's no problem with Peter projection and expanding Earth. It simply means that the continent shapes that are coming together are more Peter projection map than anything else. And I was talking to my cousin, and I had forgotten about the Peter projection map, which I'll flash on the episode here. It means all the globes are wrong. It means Google Maps is wrong. It means that all the pictures from space that NASA claims and all the other space agencies are wrong. And, there was a great video on YouTube where a guy took the blue marble shot from, I believe, Apollo 17, which is the one shot of Earth complete, supposedly on the return mission from space. And again, they got the black sea all screwed up in the first version of it, and they corrected it 20, 30 years later and didn't say a word. You can't have a photograph of the Earth where the Black Sea is like this zigzag of, formation of land. It was just horrendously put together from probably satellite photographs or high-altitude planes, and then tell you it's a photograph, right? It'd be like me sending you a picture of my face, but it looks like Picasso the first time with both my eyes on one side of my face, and then I go, oh, I'm sorry, I just crossed my eyes real bad that day. And all of a sudden it straightened out in the next photograph, right? But this video on YouTube actually overlaid the blue marble shot onto Google Maps, which was very interesting, or Google Earth, excuse me. And it's a picture of, it's the famous picture of Africa with Madagascar off to the east coast. And he immediately revealed that it's impossible to be a photograph because the proportion of Africa is wrong. Madagascar is in the wrong place, and that Madagascar is, I believe, too small compared to the accepted pop culture globe that's out there that's not Peter projection. And just a quick couple sentences on Peter projection, what ended up happening was the cartographers of the world by the mid-50s had figured out that we had gotten the maps wrong of all the continents. Now, they're almost exactly the same general shape, but the proportions are off. The continents are actually much longer than they are wide, and so they petitioned at the time. This has been covered on lots of mainstream science programs, but they petitioned the world to redo all the globes. And because old farts don't like to be called dumb, they refused to allow that to happen, and it was the last time it was ever petitioned. And so they've just been burying this science like crazy, So I think that's it. That is sort of my understanding of expanding Earth and the ecosystem of the whole thing. Again, oil is not a fossil fuel. I'm not trying to defend by any means the use of oil as the best resource that we have to create energy. I think it's an inferior product. I will say that if we stop drilling oil, the interesting thing that would happen is that it would start to surface on the surface of the Earth again, and your backyard would be flooded with crude oil, depending on where you live in the world. So we would have to get rid of this stuff somehow. Otherwise, we would have the old problems that they had in the early 1800s, in especially Texas. It's so funny, the whole Beverly Hillbillies story. Where Jed is hunting something and he shoots the ground and then oil comes up. I can tell you right now, that's very possible. It never made any sense to me as a kid. I'm like, really? You just shoot the ground and then all of a sudden oil starts coming up? Really? No, that's the way it worked. That's the way it worked because, you wouldn't hunt oil, but it could occur because there was so much oil at the surface of the Earth. But now we've drilled it all way, way down. right? So again, if you have any other questions about expanding Earth, I'll try to put all the links down there to Neil Adams' stuff. And the other gentleman did the massive amount of research. He's probably actually done a lot more lectures on this. But again, I haven't heard anyone really go for the reason why it expands. I think that you have to undo a lot of pop science out of your head to get to this point. For those of you who are interested in cosmology and subatomic physics, you need to really, really, really get back into the ethereal model. Again, Einstein threw it out the window because it threatened the oil industry. It threatened it was the basis of Tesla's zero-point energy systems. It's the reason why he created the Tesla coil, which is now turned into some, stupid little thing that makes lightning bolts. And again, the gravity episode, I highly recommend. So, deepthoughtsradio.com for all the feeds. We are now going to be down to YouTube for video. I'm experimenting with some other sources, but I'll be damned if they just are inferior. It's unbelievable trying to upload videos. There's a lot of video services out there but you have to stay under 30 minutes, or you have to stay under 500 gigs. So I'm not interested in under 30-minute episodes yet, and 500 gigs, I could probably compress it down, but then who the hell would want to watch some grainy film, right? As far as podcasting goes, we put this in your car. iTunes has it, Google Play has it, but if you just have a podcast reader on your telephone, just visit deepthoughtsradio.com and click the RSS feed. There's a Patreon account up there, and I want to thank those that contribute to Patreon. It is making a difference, and all the funds are being deposited, which is cool. Some of you have petitioned for a PayPal. I went ahead and put a PayPal link on the deepthoughtsradio.com. And, things will change over time. So I might be pointing you in a direction and something happens where these arteries don't exist. But for now, as of December 2017, this is the case. Anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.